AI first is putting AI at the start of every conversation, whether it's about people, products, policy, or whatnot, so that you make the right decisions to build real AI systems today and by starting to gather the right data rather than just trying to sprinkle it on later.
Welcome to WorkPod, friends, listeners, and viewers. So today we have an amazing guest. We have Ash Fontana. He's an active investor in AI-based concepts and companies, and soon we will learn about his journey, and we will talk about the future of work and the crossroad on AI and future of work, and also his book, the AI First Company, and then we'll talk about briefly on that. So with that, Ash, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, Ash, walk us through your journey. Like, what brought you to your passion for AI and investing? Walk us through your journey.
Yeah, I mean, two different things. Investing, I always liked sort of understanding what makes a good company. Started thinking about that and working on that when I was much, much younger. I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs, and we were constantly talking about, what makes a good business. So that was where that came from, and been investing for a long time now. I've also been working in and around technology for a long time. I was just fascinated by computers, pulling them apart again as a kid and a teenager. And, what I do sort of combines the two of those things. Where did this sort of morph into AI? I think if you spend enough time in a field, you start realizing where the really difficult things are in that field and where the really valuable things are in that field. And the intersection of those two things is where it's really exciting to exist. And I saw after many years in technology that what was starting to become really hard but really useful was working with huge volumes of data. And this was, a bit over 10 years ago now. And I decided, well, look, it's sort of obvious to me that this is going to be one of the most useful things, or this set of tools working with big data is going to be one of the most useful things for the next couple of decades. So I may as well just completely focus on that. And those tools, by another name, are AI. So that's why I decided to focus on it about a decade ago.
Interesting. So for our listeners and viewers, give your perspective on what is AI.
Yeah, sure. In a sense, AI is an unhelpfully general term because it doesn't really explain the methods used. Is it machine learning? Is it something else? And I wasn't sure if we should use that term for a while. But in a sense, AI is a really good term because of the word artificial in there. AI is not like our own intelligence. It's not like human intelligence. AI is not another extraterrestrial form of intelligence that runs itself. It's completely programmed and run by humans, and so I sort of like the definition of AI, or the term AI these days. All of that said, what is it really? It's a way to outsource something. It's a way to put a form of intelligence, a very narrow one, onto a computer and let it run while you sleep and let it run at scale and whatnot. So that's what it is. It's just a very little intelligence that you can put to work, just like you could put a machine or a person to work to do something for you.
Funny you are saying that. So if you are from the tech side of the world, right, and you understand what AI is, and when you sort of go deep into philosophical aspect of what is artificial, what is machine, what is learning, and what is intelligence, I think you're absolutely right. Many times, even I question myself, why AI? Like, what it's in many ways it's deceiving where it needs to be helpful, and it's and where it could be helpful, people don't understand what the significance is. And when you go out, talking to companies about their perspective on AI, they're not doing AI, or they are just barely glorified analytics. And I think your book laid out in that as well, that you can be analytics heavy or AI. So walk talk to us, like, from your vantage point. What are you seeing in the industry as when it comes to startup using this word called AI, and showcasing that, because it's a hot trend now. Almost every sentence
Hmm.
starts with
Hmm.
AI, whether it doesn't
Hmm.
matter or, like. So what's your take?
Yeah, look, I mean, what's working really well are perception technologies, things that see and listen, computer vision technologies, large scale analysis of speech, and now large scale analysis of big chunks of text. And then, applying those sort of core AI technologies to various industrial and commercial problems. So, for example, measuring inventory on shelves, understanding what's in a warehouse on the vision side, lots and lots of applications of computer vision, and then analyzing large volumes of text to extract meaning from news articles and whatnot. So the perception technologies are working very well. And then the other thing that's working really well is a system like what I'd call a mixed, some people call a mixed initiative system, which is, where humans are really working with the AI to correct something. So recognize this thing in this chunk of text or whatnot, but involving the human every couple of turns of the crank, so to speak, so that the human is constantly correcting the AI. So, it's working in lots of different fields. I can give hundreds of examples. And the technologies that are working are, quite specific applications of some of the core AIs.
Well said. So when you, let's wear your investor hat for a few minutes. So when you look outside and you look, the startup landscape and how AI being utilized, I think so when you evaluate a startup, how do you measure the effectiveness of its AI, or its AI
Mm.
capability? Like, how do you evaluate, if you can walk us through that?
Yeah, the broad methodology is pretty straightforward, and it's sort of like what you learned in high school about running a good experiment. What was the hypothesis? What did you think you could predict ahead of time? What was your method? What data did you put in there? What predictive modeling, what statistical models did you use? And what were the results in terms of accuracy? How closely did your prediction eventually align with reality? So, we really walk through those experiments in a very straightforward, analytical way with companies to understand how close their prediction is to being really useful. Now, that's one thing. Then you get into the detail of, okay, what is accuracy? How do you measure accuracy well? And in a sense, that's also really simple. It's, did the prediction play out? And how close to reality was your prediction in the end? How accurate was it? But you get some nuances there depending on what you're looking at. So there are other metrics to use like precision and recall, and the combination of the two, which is called an F1 score, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of ways to have an idea of accuracy. You use different tables to understand correlations at different levels of accuracy. So, there are lots of different ways to measure it, but it's not that hard, really. Like, it does come down to the basics of how did you run the experiment? Did you use a good experimental method? And how accurate was it? But digging into that level of detail is really important. Just saying we're using this method doesn't mean anything. Different methods can be really effective or really ineffective in certain domains.
And so, from companies that approach you, or from startups that approach you, what, from your vantage point, what are some of the things that they get it wrong when it comes to the meaning of AI? Like, what do you
Mm.
see as a consistent problem when you are meeting folks who are addressing, and you rightly said it, mixed, creating a mix initiatives, solving through AI? What are some of the common things that you have seen?
Well, I don't want to say anyone's really getting it wrong, to be honest, because, if anyone's trying to apply this method in the real world, um, they're probably going to yield something. some sort of insight. That's the cool thing about AI. It gives us a way to think about something. It can yield a result that in and of itself might not be useful. It might not be a super accurate, useful prediction, but it might, just by looking at it, looking at the result, what it predicted, give us a new perspective on something. So I don't want to say there's sort of a right or wrong here. I guess general pitfalls are when people think that sort of throwing something into a generic model will yield something unique. I think it really pays to think long and hard about the causes of something in a system. So, what causes customers to buy this? What causes a delivery to be on time? And trying to program that into the model and be opinionated, so to speak, about what the causes of things are and what the AI should use to make its prediction. I think that's really important. And I think people often just sort of try to throw a generic model at something and expect it to correlate its way to sensibility. But actually, we have that sensibility in our own heads. So, we can shortcut that whole process. And then another pitfall, I think, is when people get stuck really cleaning up and labeling data. And, of course, it's really important. It is important for models to have clean labeled data so that they can learn from or process it into information and then learn from that information. But, often if that's your bar for getting started, you never get started because you spend all of your time clean labeling data. Rather, it's good to just take whatever data you have, one small data set, and just start experimenting and seeing what you can predict first.
Interesting. And so we are a work podcast, so we talk about work. That's primarily our focus. So you talked about AI's somewhat it is a way to outsource. Like it's one of the way to you're outsourcing your sort of your some of your pain points. So and there's a stigma attached to AI, or whether you call it outsourcing, is people, like, so losing people and using AI to technology. What is your take? What is your take on the work side of situation? Like, so people who are basically paranoid with this idea of, hey, maybe AI is taking away my job. What would you say to those worried folks?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to talk through this, but taking the historical perspective is really important, and stepping back a bit, and realizing that, look, every time we thought technology was going to take something away, it didn't. It created more. Quality of life and employment is better than it was before we had a lot of modern technologies. We have been using technology since the beginning of time, at least beginning of time as Homo sapiens have experienced it, as humans have experienced it. So, it's just not the case that technology is bad. Technology is just a lever. It's a tool that gives us leverage so that we get more from less. We get more from our physical environment by being able to catch things that are out of our physical reach, or lift things that are beyond our muscular capacity, or our own strength. It gives us intellectual reach, allows us to think and calculate in a way where we couldn't. And what AI does, it gives us temporal leverage, that is, allows us to see a little bit ahead in time so that we can make better decisions today. So the reality is we've been using tools to get these types of leverage, physical and intellectual and now temporal leverage, forever. And we've benefited a lot from that. We've been able to eat more by doing less hunting and produce more by using more machines. So it's always been the case. Secondly, it just doesn't bear out in the data. As the adoption of AI increases, it's still very much going through its big initial phase of adoption, but you don't see jobs disappear. And then thirdly, and more constructively, you can think of all the new jobs that are being created, the different roles that exist in companies that manage large amounts of data and build predictive models that didn't exist before, or that don't exist in other companies.
I think one thing I was thinking about. So I was reading the history of automotive, and there was a sort of one of the early advertising against the idea of car. So the first car used to use a lot of lumber, and people sort of was freaking out that the car uses slightly more lumber than what a typical household during that time was requiring. So they were panicking that the world would be out of lumber and will be living in caves. And now one of the palladium, which is a very small element, is $1 billion industry in itself that's used in car as one of the converters. So on, but I think that the situation now, which even from our vantage point, we are sort of even ourselves seeing the anxiety justified, is that the speed of change has increased, right, beyond human capability. So in
Mm-hmm.
earlier cases, definitely there's a small belt, they'll suffer, probably they'll get to this new wave, they'll find better paying jobs, better paying economic opportunities, and role. But nowadays, it's all across, right? So the span is shrinking. So when you look at the situation now, and the speed of transformation, speed of digitalization, speed of AI, and humans are lateral when it comes to our way to retrain and re-equip ourselves, right? Some of us are blessed that we are slightly more inclined to technology, but many of us are not that blessed, where we are not very close, our job is not very close to technology. So from your vantage point, what do you see as uh, some of the next few steps in the work side of the community, so they can sort of get on the positive side of AI rather than the negative side?
And so, do you mean there, like, what can people do to train themselves up for this next era? Is that right?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really just starts with numeracy, getting as numerate as possible, especially learning as many statistical methods as possible, because that's what we've got now. We've got more data available about what's going on in our world, structured data from sensors, from phones, cameras, microphones, etc., from things going into databases, the exhaust of all the software that we use, the data exhaust, so to speak. So we've got more data, and we can use that data to generate information. We can process it and figure out, this is something that can inform our understanding of a situation, of who our customers are, of what the demand pattern for this, sweater or this type of clothing is. Or this type of food, for how this medicine is produced, for how this disease manifests itself in the human body. We've got more data about that, and we can process it to get some information about some of these fundamental things that are happening in the world. And then from that information, we can learn. We can learn really how it's happening. And once you learn, then you can make a prediction, see if it plays out, and then learn from the result. And so really that's what we do all day long with our brains. We're predictive machines, but it's what we can now do on a computational substrate, on computers. And so it all starts with being numerate. It all starts with understanding statistics so that you can work with data. So that's one thing. But it doesn't have to be all about mathematics and statistics and whatnot. There's a lot around telling stories with data that's really useful these days. There's a lot around just understanding the biology of other beings, whether it's animals or humans or whatnot, and how they learn, and then maybe trying to transfer that onto a computer one day. And that's coming at it from the biological perspective rather than the mathematical. There are lots of ways you can learn this sort of stuff. You can learn it in the field of economics with econometrics, with geology, geostatistics, biostatistics. There are lots of ways you can come at this, but AI is not this whole separate field that people think about. It's actually a combination of lots of fields, and you can come at it in lots of different ways. And I've got a whole reading list on my website that tries to give people a way to approach the field, no matter what their existing interests are, whether you're interested in markets or economics, whether you're interested in science, or whether you're interested in computers, of course. So there are lots of ways you can approach this, and there are lots of ways you can learn. You can just read around the area, you can brush up on statistics, or you can take one of the many courses out there in machine learning that are really good.
And for people who are, say, coal miners of the world, or or they are truck drivers of the world, who are again not very aligned with the technology. Slightly,
Mm.
there's an air gap between what their day-to-day job is and what technology is, how transformation is happening. Um, so from your vantage point, like I'm curious personally, are you seeing what are some of the trends that you are seeing where AI is disrupting for good people like the truck drivers of the world or coal miners of the world? Like, do you see? I give you one brief story. So one of the governments, one of the labor departments, so they contacted, they spoke with us and they say, Vishal, you know what? Uh, Governments pay, people pay taxes, machine won't, and if people don't pay taxes, governments will go bankrupt. And we are seeing writing on the wall, right? So we are seeing writing on the wall that we are failing to retrain our workforce, to train them fast enough to this new reality, new economic opportunities, and we will lose out to that phenomena. So after listening to that, we shifted on understanding the technology landscape. Like, so how is technology addressing this mass relearning and retraining effort that is required? Joe Biden said it in his infrastructure plan, that there's a massive knowledge gap that is being created even in continental US, that needs to sort of. So what are you seeing from your vantage point as an investor in in the AI ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm really not seeing anyone's jobs be totally disrupted. I'm seeing a lot of people be assisted by AI in their jobs. But you know, just to react there, there's a couple of things that people say, and you've highlighted some of those things there that just don't make any sense. I've got to be honest. One, you said there, someone had said, machines don't pay taxes, but people do. Well, machines are owned by companies, and companies pay taxes. Machines are owned by people, and people pay taxes. They're not this sort of sub or super sovereign entity that is not belonging to any one place. They operate in a world, and that world is governed by something. So that one doesn't really make sense. And then a lot of the examples people use about job replacement, or for the job replacement argument, are really far-fetched. If you think of something like what a truck driver does or what a coal miner does, that's honestly one of the last things that are going to be completely automated, because there's so many steps involved. The stakes are so high, of doing something in a coal mine that could lead to some sort of disaster, collapse, or whatnot, or of driving a really big, heavy vehicle and it going out of control. The stakes are so high, and the environments in which they operate are so dynamic. They're natural environments. It's out in the road, rain, cold, wind, etc. It's in a coal mine underground with all sorts of different systems, different levels of humidity and water and whatnot, and gas restriction and production. These environments are very complex. And so it's very hard to build a system. It's basically impossible to build a system that can be right most of the time in a high stakes environment, and especially where that environment is complex. So a lot of those examples don't really make sense. But, again, going back to the core of this, which is like what jobs are going to be automated, again, I don't see a lot. Like, the state of the art of AI systems is that they need training. They need humans to run them, to tell them what to do. So it's very rare that you see anything get fully automated in those fields.
I think so. That's a valid point, and I think one of the undercurrent on what I'm saying and what we are hearing, it's not so much to do with how the jobs are going to be automated completely, but it's the inability to retrain workforce to take advantage of
Mm,
the economic opportunities that are being created by AI, right? What I can understand and empathize on the government workers, because what they are saying to me, what I'm hearing, what they are saying to me is that there are a lot more opportunities, high paying jobs that my people could be taking, but it's in our inability to train them to those new high paying job, causing us losing taxes, because the job that they're doing, it's the demand
mm,
is shrinking. at some capacity because
Yeah.
of other economic opportunities are being created by many of these in many of these places. So from your vantage point about this knowledge gap, right? So basically, this new economics AI is doing beautiful job when it comes to creating new economic opportunities. From what are you seeing as a trend or pattern where the learning and development aspect of the economy is handled by AI, or is that you do you see as an opportunity that's yet to be explored? Like I'm curious, personal from personal
Mm.
sake.
Yeah. Look, I think it's like anything. If there's an opportunity in front of you and you want to take advantage of it, you're going to have to work to take advantage of it. There are costs to taking on new opportunities. And of course, you can stay in an industry and operate the same way you've always operated. But things change, and you should expect at some point for the opportunity you're prosecuting in that industry the same way you always have to just go away. So it's I think of it as just like a very optional thing. If you want to engage in the new way of doing things, the way that's driven by intelligent systems and uses these very powerful tools, well, there's a cost to taking up that opportunity. And if you don't have to. Just as individuals, if you want to use Spotify or Netflix or Amazon, then you can, and you might benefit from that. You might get something cheaper, it might arrive faster, or it might just be a better experience. But if you don't want to, that's fine too. You can still get movies and music and products the old way. So for just like businesses and individuals can choose um, what they do with their money and their time, that is the case with AI too. You can choose to invest your money and your time in training up and using it, or you can ignore it for a bit longer. That's fine too.
Interesting. And you talk to a lot of companies about their adoption of AI, their understanding of AI. From your vantage point, what are some of the misunderstanding that companies have about AI? Like, can you name
Mm.
few?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that, it is autonomous, that you can just sort of throw a bunch of data into it and it will work. That's the reality is just not there. That's just not right. You do need to work with it. You do need to give it some clues, so to speak. You do need to help train it. You do need to correct it so that it can learn over time. Just like, when you're raising a kid, you can't just put the kid in the world and expect it to survive completely and well. Maybe it will survive, but it won't necessarily thrive. You've got to teach it lessons. You've got to share what you've learned. You've got to help correct it where it puts a foot wrong. So it's the same with AIs in some respects and in a funny way. So I think there's a misconception that you can sort of just have this stuff work out of the box. It actually requires a lot of fine tuning by hand. The second misconception is that you can just throw any data that you've got into it. The reality is, as I said before, a lot of models need data with a lot of context, a lot of structure, lots of tags on it, so that it really understands what's going on. It needs an image that says, okay, there is a dog in this image or a cat in this image or not. And it needs lots of examples of that for it to learn what a dog or a cat is. And so you need to train and label things a lot. And that can be pretty expensive because it has to happen manually. And then I think the other thing that's a bit of a misconception here in the positive is that you need highly, highly specialized people to do this. The reality is a lot of the specialists that work at the very big companies have created these very good tools that you can use that get you very far along, get you a very long way to adopting AI and help you sort of train your own things, train your own models and whatnot, using your own data and your own expertise. And so, I think if you're a bit curious, a little bit savvy, you can get started really easily. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So yeah, I think they're probably the top three.
Interesting. And and if you are say an entrepreneur, or if you are with an entrepreneurial mindset today, and you want to harness the use of AI in solving some of the world's largest or biggest challenges, where do you see opportunities today that exist where people could venture in and solve?
Oh yeah, absolutely everywhere. I think the question is not, where could AI be applied, but where could you uniquely apply AI? It's a very general purpose technology. It has uses in all sorts of environments because really it's just about bringing the future forward. It's about making a prediction, or it's about automating something that you already do. And so we all do lots of things, and we all would like to know a lot of things about the future, no matter what industry you're in. So it's not a question of what it's applicable to. It's just a question of, as I said, what you can apply it to. And that is a function of what you know. It's a function of what industry have you been in? What do you know about the dynamics of that industry? What do you know about the economics of that industry? As in, what would be really impactful to automate? What's really expensive to do today that is done over and over and over again and that is sort of annoying to do? That gives you a clue as to what would be really good to automate. Now, whether AI can automate that is another question, but you only know that by being in an industry a long time. And the same on the prediction side, that's on the automation side. What would give you a real edge over the competition to know ahead of time? That is something that you learn or have a feeling for, having been in industry a long time. So whatever industry you're in, I think start with the knowledge you have and then go from there and try to apply AI to predict something or automate something.
Interesting. I'm curious to learn. So, what is your take on um, the ethical part of AI, right? So, ethics and AI, because we have seen many black swan moment. We have seen our increased reliance on data and models somehow, if not done right, could sort of go in a different direction. So, what is your take on the like ethics and AI as two
Mhm.
competing forces?
Well, look, it's obviously a big area of consideration. The way that AIs manifest themselves in every industry means that, there are a lot of considerations, some of them general and some of them specific to certain industries. So, it's very hard to generalize and talk broadly about the ethics of AI. What I will say is there are some uses of the technology today that can be a little bit dangerous, and that sort of open us up to some potentially negative consequences. And so I think the EU is taking good leadership there, or showing good leadership there in terms of banning certain uses of it. Um, and that's, there's never so clearly a right and wrong. It's all a question of like what your system is and what your values are. But there are some cases where it's mostly agreed that it's a bit wrong. And so again, the EU is taking a good leadership role there. I think otherwise, one other perspective to consider is just a very standard utilitarian perspective if we're to talk about ethics here, which is, what do you get from it and what does it cost? What are the potential downsides? And so, I often think, just try to apply AI in fields where the consequences of it being wrong are not very high, because it will be wrong sometimes. It's a probabilistic system. So at some point, it will probably be wrong. And so don't use it in fields where if it makes a bad prediction, the consequences are going to be catastrophic, like in some areas of medicine, using AI to diagnose and treat diseases. That's probably often going to be pretty devastating if it's wrong. And so maybe don't focus on those areas. And on the flip side, of the corollary of this is focus on areas where, AI just brings a net gain, as in, discovers something that's always going to be good to discover, like, to put it in a very sort of dollars and cents way, a new sales lead or a new marketing channel or way to market to customers. So that's another way I think about it in terms of the sort of payoff you get from using AI. And I think the third perspective to offer here on the ethical side of things is, consider what the world would be like if we didn't use this. We'd be missing out on a lot of opportunities to live a better life, to have better forms of entertainment, to get access to food more cheaply and quickly, because AI allows us to automate the production of a lot of these things. And so I think it's sort of repugnant to not explore this technology based on some preconceived notion of what it can and can't do, because we don't know what it can and can't do. And there is a lot of potential upside here. And so, I think we are, well, I don't like to use the word should, but I will, because I can't think of another one. But I think we should explore it, because if we don't, we're missing out. And, that's not a good thing.
Interesting. And one more perspective of yours. So on the governance side of data and AI. So I was talking to one of the largest aircraft engine manufacturer, and they were talking about, and he was talking about the telematics, right? So how telematics and this boundaries play along. So his point of view was, Vishal, our struggle is, if suppose our aircraft land from one continent or different country, and the data is downloaded to one of the local servers there, and then moved to somewhere else, we process something. So, and many of these sort of have this, the regulation and the policy is still sort of being thought out and sorted out. And he was saying that we have more lawyers than engineers working on this problem. So what is your take on, how would the legislative or a regulatory scene could pan out? What is your take? I'm curious to learn.
Yeah, look, I think it's good to get as many people as possible involved in thinking about the potential implications of AI and how we can get ahead of that with policy. Because, there is a big knowledge gap between policymakers today and those making the systems. There's a huge knowledge gap. I think a lot of people aren't necessarily thinking about the potential of this, not only in terms of the impact on people's lives, but the impact on the economy, positive in terms of the opportunities, and negative in terms of the potential for power consolidation, because of the type of competitive advantage that AI gives you. It's very strong and it compounds very quickly. And so I think the more people we have thinking about this, the better. And I think a lot of knowledge transfer would be a good thing.
Awesome. So let's jump on the meat of the conversation about your book.
Yeah.
By the way, very clever title. Talk to us about the story behind the AI first company. Like, why this title? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think there's just an imperative to put AI first. It is such a powerful tool. Other companies are putting it first and doing very well. AI first companies like Google and Microsoft are trillion-dollar companies. And if you don't sort of think about it and put it first, then your competition is going to outpace you. So I think there's a real imperative to think about AI and put it first. I think that imperative is exactly that. It's to put it first in conversations, not just technology conversations or research and development conversations, but in every conversation about who you're going to hire, where you're going to allocate money, what policy initiatives you're going to get involved with, how you're going to price your product, etc. AI is something that really permeates lots of parts of a business. As in, if you're going to really be an AI first company, you have to think, well, of the products we make, how are they going to collect more data to get better and better? And in terms of where we're going to allocate capital this quarter, if we allocate it to collecting data now, we have more potential to build AIs in future. Whereas if we don't, we're going to have to try and scramble to collect that data later to train the model. Or, the people we're going to hire, they either have the capability to understand these huge volumes of data or how to work with them or not. So, you really have to put AI first in all of these conversations across your organization to have the capabilities of building it. And yeah, again, the time is now because other companies are doing it. So that's what I wanted to sort of get across with the title, is the imperative to put AI first in every conversation, because it's really hard to sprinkle, so to speak, AI on top of something later on. You have to be constantly collecting the data, refining the models and whatnot, to have AI that's truly impactful, that truly works really well.
Interesting. And I'm curious. So when I was reading this book, I think it was a pretty interesting read, by the way. So so I'm coming from the technology and understanding business. So
Mm-hmm.
to me, what I end up getting from the book was definitely some of my favorite terms, some of my favorite models, some of things that I'm used to seeing, and I was just skimming
Mm-hmm.
through many of these areas and learning about the business aspect. And I was when I was reading it, I was thinking that in your mind, who is the ideal reader that you wrote this
Mm.
thing book for? Because I'm gonna, by the way, I'm gonna give this book to a friend of mine who is the other side of this equation. So he's a business guy, have no clue what technology is, and I want to see reaction, what happens to
Mm.
him. So I'm curious, like when you're writing this book, who was your ideal reader?
Yeah, look, I really hope the book is useful for people, whether they're running a small business or a large business, whether they're starting a new business or working in an existing business, whether they're running the business or they're a manager at a business, and no matter what industry. I really wrote the book for everyone in that regard, because I do think, as I've said, this technology is so applicable across so many different industries and so many different cases. And I do think that if you start putting AI first now, you can be a company that builds real AI. You don't have to have started with it from day one. That's not the case. Um, and I also think that, as I've said, a lot of people can work with this technology. You don't need a really strong background in the field to work with it. And finally, I think it can help a lot of people, whether you're trying to take on a project and get noticed for making a difference so that you get promoted, or whether you're trying to make your business more profitable so that, it can be a better small business for you that serves you better. I think AI can really help in all of those ways. So I wrote it for everyone. In a sense, part of the book is written sort of more like a business strategy book. Part of it's written more like a technology book and technology strategy, but sort of really quite techy. And another part of the book is written more like an organizational strategy book. So there's sort of something in it for everyone. There's sort of multiple different types of vocabulary I use throughout. And yeah, there are equations in there and there are numbers in there and whatever else, but you can actually skip all of that and still get the same value out of the book. They're just there for people who really like to think that way. So, if you do like to think quantitatively, I think that will be at least partially satisfied in the book. And if you don't, that's fine. You can skip those bits. So, yeah, I tried to write it for a lot of people, but, to really get to the point of your question, I wrote the book for people who want to use this tool to make a difference. That's it.
I think so. My personal experience is so I was excited to pick this book because I think I'm
Hmm.
as a business. So we have a business in AI. So we are
Mm-hmm.
curious to know how what are some of the philosophical thinking and ideological thinking when it comes to building an AI company, right? So what are some of the challenges? And having when I picked this book, I'm expecting an investor who's passionate about AI writing about business and AI. So I'll see that imagery. And when I read this book, it definitely touched up many of my anxiety points. So it touched
Hmm.
up the ROI aspect of things. It touched up about analytics and AI issues. It touched up on data and AI and perspective. So to our listeners and viewers, I think I agree with you, Ash, that a lot of people would this book would resonate with a lot of people who are at a different aspect of this book, trying to understand the neighbors, trying to understand, as you rightly pointed out, that parts is ops, parts is strategy, parts is AI or the technology. So it's, I think, from the laying out perspective, there's a definitely lot of nuggets um, that you created, and it's an interesting playbook.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and I like that you use the word playbook there, because that's what it's trying to be. It's trying to be a playbook. And look, this is why I wrote the book, because there isn't a playbook out there for creating this sort of company. And I've been fortunate enough to work with pioneers in the field of AI and learn how to build this sort of company. And we learned together. We faced the challenges together and solved them bit by bit. Challenges like, how do you convince customers to let you work with their data so that you can make a model for them? How do you price a product so that you encourage more usage to get more data rather than extract the most value from day one? So how do you sort of work with the policies out there around data collection, retention, etc.? How do you hire people when you don't have the budget for very skilled PhDs coming out of the world's top institutions? These were all challenges that we faced. We learned how to face them, and I'm hoping to share those lessons in this book in a way that's more like a playbook, more like a step-by-step guide than a bunch of theoretical frameworks. You certainly need the theory. You need the theory of competitive advantage, and that was another reason to write the book, which is to give people the theory to help understand the sort of advantage AI gives you. But really what people want is a playbook to put it into practice.
Interesting. And I was curious when I was reading the book that I want your perspective on, as an investor, what is an AI first company to you? Like, so when a startup pitches you, how do you decide which company fits in this mold of AI? Like, what are your qualifying criteria? If you can share some of those.
Yeah, it's a company that fundamentally develops a competitive advantage through that. They may have a brand, they may have a sort of side network effect going on. They may have something else. They may have a patent around something. So they may have other ways to enjoy a competitive advantage in their market. But really where they're putting all their time and money is in developing a competitive advantage through data. And that's where I focus my efforts and I focus my time understanding is companies that build a competitive advantage through data. As in, the reason customers choose you, the reason they pay more for your product is because you offer such a significantly higher degree of predictive accuracy or automation than the competition.
Interesting. And you talked about data learning effects. Walk us through what data learning effect is. I'm curious. Like, what's your perspective?
So a data learning effect is the automatic compounding of information. And so three important words there: automatic, compounding, and information. So let's work back and go through the three parts of a data learning effect. So firstly, you need a critical mass of data. In some cases, this could be a very large amount of data. For example, if you're trying to recognize something in an image, you need lots of examples of it for a machine to be able to learn from it. Or it could be a very small amount of data. But the point is you need a critical mass of data so that, two, you can process it into information. You use techniques to clean the data, label the data, etc., to turn data, sort of ones and zeros, binary values, categorical values, into information, a picture of what you're looking at, of the customer you're looking at, of the system you're trying to model. And then thirdly, you need a network of models that can learn from that information. So they're interconnected. They see a bit of information, correlate it with another bit of information, form a conclusion, pass it on to the next model that then takes the output of that and something else, does a derivation, learns something from that, passes it on to the next one. And so you've got three things: a critical mass of data, capabilities to process that data into information, and a network of models that can learn from that information. And so the first part is sort of big data, so to speak. The second part is analytics. And the third part is machine learning, mostly, not always. And you need all three of these things to get this loop going. And this loop being the way that ideally automatically compounds information. So the loop being, you gather data from the real world, you process it, you make a prediction, and you see how that plays out in the real world, and you learn from it. Was that prediction right or wrong? And if it's right, then you reinforce that loop. Next time you go around, you do the same thing again. If it's wrong, you adjust it. And then hopefully next time it's better. So it's automatically going through these cycles every so often, and it's compounding in value when it's right. It's getting better and better, or it's learning from what it's observing in the real world. So that's what a data learning effect is. And again, you need all three parts of that. It's not just about having scale to data. And it's not just about having some sort of network effect. It's not just about having capabilities around data processing. It's all of those things.
Interesting. And one I was thought I was when you were saying this, I was thinking about that. So when you say normal persona about AI that people have is, hey, AI will decide something on my behalf and take a decision. So say if you're an AI first company, you build yourself to take decisive action quickly and sort of beat your competition to it. How do you decide what are some of like which predictions to pursue? Like how do you figure out um what are good
It's a very
decision
good
versus bad?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It goes back to what we were sort of touching on before, but didn't go into. So I'm glad you followed up with this one. What's the payoff is one question. Is it going to be the case that when the prediction's right, you get something really valuable, but when it's wrong, it's really costly? So consider the sort of payoff. Two, what's the potential for drift? Is in these models train on a set of data that is collected from the real world. But is the real world, the environment in which you're operating, changing so quickly that the data that you've got to train the model actually won't represent the real world in 35 seconds or 35 microseconds, like in financial markets? And so if there's really high potential for drift there, then it might not be a good AI problem, because you're going to have to gather data and retrain so quickly that you won't be able to keep up. So there's certain ways in which we sort of understand how these models work that inform whether or not they'll be applicable to a certain problem. And I have a whole checklist in the book, a series of questions that say, okay, is it this or is it that? Is there high potential for drift, low potential for drift, etc.? Is there high demand for variety? Is there a reason to have a model spitting out lots and lots of options for customers when they go to a website to buy something, lots of recommendations? Or is that not really valuable, in which case you can just have a human curating one thing for people to buy? If there's high demand for variety, it's a good problem for an AI-based recommender system. If there's low demand for variety, it's not. You may as well just use a human curator, as I said. So I've got a whole list of questions that sort of help you work through if something is a good prediction problem, and that's a sample from that list.
Interesting. And I think that thank you so much for walking us through.
Mm-hmm.
Exciting book again. I think it's very useful. I find it pretty interesting read, and I'll definitely get one more perspective. I want to know how someone who's not
Great.
technical would go through this, because it's
Yeah.
fascinating. And thank you for putting it so much good insights in there. So let's talk about. So we have this next round. We call it rapid fire, right? So the
Okay.
idea is that I'll throw out something. You just tell us what comes to your mind, and if you want to reminisce, feel free to walk down the trail as well. So should we start that?
Let's go.
Yes. So machine learning,
AI today.
technology,
Tool.
leadership,
AI first.
future of work,
Less.
culture,
Was that culture? Mm, data centric.
digital transformation,
All software will be intelligent.
disruption,
AI first disruption.
jobs of future,
more leisure, less work.
Future of startups.
Everyone is their own startup.
Well said. Future of organizations.
Decentralized.
AI first.
Company. Book.
Most cheesiest answer ever, I guess. Yeah.
That's cool.
Awesome. So let's spend. We're at the tail end of the conversation. So let's
Sure.
spend few minutes on your journey, right? So we asked all of our guests to share some of the traits and some of the things that have made them successful, or that have helped them become what they have become. So what are some of those qualities that you attribute your success to?
Yeah, I think there's a series of lessons that I learned from people around me that I've really taken to heart, that were really ingrained in me, and that I've lived through. In that, I try to really live according to the values embedded in those lessons. One is just finishing a job. If you start something, take it to the end so that you can actually get the output and learn from it and do the next thing. So just finishing what you start, I think, is really important. The second thing is try to make yourself redundant. And I think that's a really good principle. Try to think, how do I turn this into a process that someone else can pick up and run with? How do I train someone so well that, they don't need me anymore, and that they can really own something that will motivate them more, that will free me up to do other things. And the process of training is a really beautiful thing as well, of teaching someone something. So the making yourself redundant sort of gets you in that mindset of like properly training, delegating, teaching, turning things into process, documenting things. So that's another thing that I've really tried to think through and apply every day. And the other thing is just showing up. So the first thing is something my dad's taught me: finish the job. The second thing is something a professional mentor taught me. And the third thing is something that my mum taught me, which is, I really believe it's all of our responsibilities to manage our own energy by doing things like eating well, sleeping well, and moving well, so that every day you show up with a consistent level of energy, so that you're able to have the conversations you need to have, to make the decisions you need to make with in a very lucid way, and to be able to do the work you need to do for others. I think, showing up with inconsistent energy, getting sick all the time, doing this, doing that, sometimes this stuff's out of our control, but a lot of the time it really is in our control. But it requires a huge amount of discipline to show up every single day with that energy, and to be well in your role, to be well in your workplace, and be there for others, and available and ready to go at any given time. So yeah, they're the three things that I really just sort of keep in mind every day. I try to finish what I start. I try to turn something into a process, try to make myself redundant in some way, teach someone else something so that they can run with it. And three, I try to just show up, very, very consistently with very consistent energy.
Thank you for walking us through that. So we ask all of our guests to share some of their favorite reads. So besides the AI first company,
Sure.
what are some of your favorite reads that you want to share with our listeners and viewers?
Well, look, I have so many areas of interest, but I guess they sort of all consolidate into three different fields. One, intelligent systems; two, investing; and three, Italian culture and history. What I might do is I might stick to that first category, intelligent systems. Now, I will say the website for the book has a lot of other books on there. I show all these different ways you can approach this field of intelligent systems. Some of my favorite is a book by Jeff Hawkins called On Intelligence, and he actually just released a new book. But On Intelligence really gave me a model of how the human mind works that helped me understand how to build predictive systems better than any other model of the human mind. There are lots of great neuroscience books out there, but that was a really good one. The second book that really helped me understand intelligence is a book called Neurophilosophy. It was written by a couple, and they were real pioneers in the field of neurophilosophy, really sort of started this field of philosophy. And it's a phenomenal book because it is scientifically rigorous, it is obviously philosophically rigorous, and it's a very sort of complete work in that field. It gives you sort of a survey of the entire field in one book. So I really think that is a phenomenal book. It's very involved. It's a very dense book. It's a textbook, really. But I liked that one a lot, and I think that gave me a really good foundation for understanding a lot of other things. And a really fun book in the field of intelligent systems, a fictional book, is Neuromancer by William Gibson. I just find him to be such a great writer. He manages to keep lots of storylines going at the one time, and without sort of collapsing them onto each other or mixing them up, but he keeps them going in parallel really nicely. His characterizations are amazing. He manages to set up lots of different characters in a book, as in the characters are so different from each other, but manage to interact and have dialogue with each other. That's really fun to read. And he's a really prescient person. He saw a lot of stuff well before a lot of other people saw it. Sorry, Neil Stephenson. He's a really good author. William Gibson's also another good author. But I think in the field of intelligent systems and thinking about sort of sci-fi stuff, I really like Neuromancer. Pretty classic book in the field. I'm not alone there.
Thank you for sharing that. So now, last but not the least, so if you have a parting thought for our listeners and viewers, like what would that be? What would you like to tell to our listeners and viewers who are curious about being AI first?
Yeah, I would say, you just get started now. Like, it's just all about trying now. You can start really small. You can start with just, one computer, one idea, one person. Just get started now. Like, pick up the book, pick up other books, and get into this field now, because, we're only halfway through what I call the AI first century. We've still got a long way to go, but, if you leave it any longer, this stuff's going to really sort of permeate everything really quickly. And you want to be on the forefront of that. And now is the time. Now is the time where it's actually working. It's actually having real impact in lots of businesses and in society every day. And it's still very accessible. And we're still sort of just at the cusp of seeing what's possible, because a lot of these other tools and whatever else are available to us to start experimenting at a faster rate. So it's a great time to get into the field. It's a great time to learn, and anyone can get started.
With that, thank you so much, Ash. It was thank you for sitting with us, helping us understand the landscape of AI and startup, helping us understand the AI first ideology. And again, to our listeners and viewers, it's an interesting read. It's a good read. I think you should, if you're curious about the capability of AI, understanding AI, and understanding how AI could be used in your business construct, it's a good playbook to keep. And as I think Ash put it best, that you just can skim over to your most pressing need and just understand what's going on. And so it's a very good book to keep on the side as you are building an AI first company. And Ash, thank you so much in spreading awareness about AI, being a champion in promoting this AI first ideology, and putting this interesting book together.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for saying those words and encouraging people in that way to pick up what they can and go from there.
I was homesick, never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick.